Here's a quick note for the listeners who have been with me for the first 3 episodes. Consider those the rock drill. We are building the con op and dusting off the sand table. Today marks the hard launch. We're stepping off on a specific mission, a countdown to the 250th anniversary of the founding of the United States. Between now and July 4th, 2026, we are going to systematically neutralize the mythology of the so-called Christian founding and restore the verified and factual history of how this republic was built. The grifters are already selling their version of the 250th. This series is the counter-argument. Welcome to the fight. But for the first time in several years, the screaming about the radical left's war on Christmas has been muted. It's mostly been relegated to the dregs of small-time Christian nationalist talking heads desperately trying to keep the grift alive. Apparently, public perception has finally caught up to the reality. The war on Christmas doesn't exist. But don't pop the champagne just yet. Just because the enemy is imaginary doesn't mean the battle is over. The war on Christmas hasn't been defeated, it's metastasized. It mated with the war on woke and birthed an even uglier, stupider monster. Instead of just harassing checkout clerks for saying happy holidays, the Christian nationalists have moved on to getting angry at retailers for putting the Grinch on sweaters and organizing boycotts against businesses who have the audacity to hire diverse employees. But before we move on to the next panic, let's do an after-action report. What was the war on Christmas? How did it start? And why is it finally losing its popularity? If you've heard about the war on Christmas, you probably associate it with coffee, specifically Starbucks. That's ground zero for a lot of people. You are listening to False Foundation. I'm Jim. We are here to dismantle the Christian nationalist myths of the American founding and look at the cold, hard mechanics of how our republic was actually built. No idols, no pedestals, just the facts. Let's move out. For a long time, Starbucks put a standard holiday imagery on their cups. Sleds, snowflakes, snowmen, the usual secular winter aesthetic. Then in 2015, they made a tactical error. They released a cup that was just red. A nice, simple, ombre red cup. The reaction from the far right was immediate and severe. It was as if Starbucks had printed the cups with the blood of the innocent. An internet evangelist named Joshua Feuerstein went viral with a rant claiming Starbucks had issued a corporate fatwa banning employees from saying Merry Christmas. His logic was airtight. Starbucks removed the snowflakes because they hated Jesus. He followed this fever dream by begging his followers to go to Starbucks and tell the clerks their name was Merry Christmas. That way, when the order was ready, the barista would be forced to say it out loud. Take that, minimum wage service worker. That'll show you to make me coffee. So did Starbucks actually issue a gag order on Christmas? Short answer, no. They didn't care. In response to the hysteria, Starbucks released a statement that essentially said, "Our partners are not banned from saying Merry Christmas. We encourage them to connect with customers in the way that feels natural," which is corporate speak for please buy the latte and leave. As for the cup design, they said they wanted a, quote, purity of design that welcomes all of our stories, end quote. Essentially, draw your own snowman if you miss it that much. The irony here is rich. Starbucks never had Jesus on their cups. They never had a nativity scene or Bible verses. They had snowflakes. The Christian symbols conservatives were fighting for were actually secular symbols of winter weather. But facts don't matter when you're building a persecution complex. But the truth is, Starbucks was just a skirmish. The war started long before the Red Cup. Let me introduce you to Peter Brimelow. Hopefully you've never heard of him. He runs a website called VDare, that's VDARE, named after Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the Americas. That should tell you everything you need to know about his priorities. Brimelow is obsessed with white identity, and he finds the fact that he was born in the UK confusingly irrelevant to his American nativism. Way back in 1999, Brimelow launched a challenge on his website. He asked his followers to spy on businesses. He wanted them to report any organization that used Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas. He wasn't doing this to save Jesus. He explicitly argued that Happy Holidays was an act of erasing white identity. It wasn't about theology, it was about demographics. But if Brimelow drew up the battle plans, Bill O'Reilly issued the order. Starting in 2004, O'Reilly launched a recurring segment on Fox News called Christmas Under Siege. He took Brimelo's white nationalist anxiety, scrubbed off the overt racism, and repackaged it as a defense of traditional values. He put up lists of retailers like Target and Macy's and told his millions of viewers to boycott them. O'Reilly achieved something truly impressive. He changed the way his listeners heard a pleasant seasonal greeting. When a clerk said Happy Holidays, O'Reilly viewers didn't hear inclusivity. They heard fuck you. And then there's John Gibson, another Fox News anchor who drafted the Field Manual. In 2005, he published a book called The War on Christmas: How the Liberal Plot to Ban the Sacred Christian Holiday is Worse Than You Thought. This wasn't a book about the Gospels, it was an operations manual. He identified targets like the ACLU, school boards, Walmart, and gave his readers talking points to attack them. He literally compared the war on Christmas to the war on terror. In his mind, saying Happy Holidays made you a spiritual terrorist bent on destroying America's resolve. But I have to correct the record on one thing. While Fox News industrialized the war on Christmas, they didn't build the factory. The prototype for this panic was actually built in the 1950s by the John Birch Society. If you don't know them, the John Birch Society was a far-right anti-communist group that thought Dwight Eisenhower was a secret communist agent. In 1959, they released a pamphlet titled There Goes Christmas? Their argument was that the United Nations was plotting to remove religious imagery from department store windows and replace it with UN globalist decorations. They claimed this was a psychological operation to weaken the American resolve against Marxism. If you could take Christ out of the holiday, you could take the capitalist out of the American. This is the missing link in the authority narrative. In the 1950s, Christianity wasn't just faith, it was a weapon in the Cold War. Godless communism was the enemy, so godly Americanism was the shield, asserting the authority of Christmas in a way of pledging allegiance to the state. If you said Happy Holidays in 1959, you weren't just being secular, you were being subversive. You were practically handing the nuclear codes to Khrushchev. So when O'Reilly brought this back in 2004, he was tapping into a very old, very specific American anxiety, the fear that if we lose our symbols, we lose our power. Before we look at the history, we have to ask why. Why does the most powerful religion in the history of the Western world need to pretend it's being oppressed by a coffee cup? It's about the economy of outrage. In the military, we had a saying, complacency kills. But in the media, complacency cancels. If you aren't angry, you aren't watching. Bill O'Reilly and John Gibson didn't invent the war on Christmas because they were theologians. They invented it because fear is a fantastic retention strategy. If you tell your audience, hey, everything is fine, your neighbors just want to be inclusive, they change the channel. But if you tell them they are coming for your Lord and Savior and only I can tell you how to stop them, well, now you have a soldier. You have mobilized a viewer. This connects directly to the authority theme. To maintain authority, you need an enemy. If you are the dominant culture, which Christianity undeniably is in America, you can't be the underdog, and Americans love an underdog. So you have to manufacture a scenario where the empire is actually the rebel alliance. You have to convince the guy with his foot on the neck of culture that he is the one being suffocated. The war on Christmas allows the majority to cosplay as a persecuted minority. It grants them the moral license to be aggressive. If you are at war, you don't have to be polite. You don't have to be tolerant. You can demand that the minimum wage cashier say Merry Christmas because you aren't being a jerk, you're being a patriot. You're fighting the spiritual Taliban at the Starbucks counter. Here's where it gets funny. The conservatives screaming about tradition are actually fighting against their own history. If they really want to return to the roots of American Christianity, they should be banning Christmas. That's right. The first war on Christmas on American soil wasn't started by the ACLU. It was started by the Pilgrims. Christmas Day, 1621. Most of the Pilgrims went out to work in the fields because that's what you do on a Tuesday. But a group of newcomers refused to work, saying it was against their conscience. Governor William Bradford, being a benevolent leader, let them rest. But later that day, Bradford found them playing stool ball, basically cricket, in the street. That was too much. He confiscated their equipment and told them, quote, if you want to make the keeping of Christmas a matter of devotion, stay in your houses and pray, but there will be no gaming or reveling in the streets, end quote. That's the first recorded attempt by a government official to shut down a Christmas party in American history. And it was done by the guy we celebrate at Thanksgiving. Then you have the Presbyterians. When they settled the frontier in Appalachia and Pennsylvania, they brought the Church of Scotland's views with them, and the Church of Scotland hated Christmas. They banned it in 1640, calling it a superstitious idolatry. This caused massive friction between their Anglican neighbors who loved a good party. To a Presbyterian, an Anglican Christmas feast looked like a pagan orgy. And then the big one. In 1659, the Massachusetts Bay Colony officially outlawed Christmas. The law read, quote, "The observation of Christmas having been deemed a sacrilege is hereby forbidden. If you were caught feasting or taking the day off, you were fined 5 shillings. Why? Because the Puritans knew the truth. Christmas isn't a Christian holiday. It's a pagan party that the church hijacked. They hated the drinking, the disorder, and the popish rituals." And let's not forget the Quakers, the conscientious objectors of the war on Christmas. Quakers believed that every day was equally holy. Setting aside December 25th as special was an insult to the other 364 days God made. So in 1750s Philadelphia, while the Anglicans were getting drunk and the Presbyterians were scowling, the Quakers engaged in passive resistance. They deliberately opened their shops, plowed their fields, and sent their kids to school on December 25th. To a Quaker, working on Christmas was an act of worship. Even the Baptists, the ancestors of today's Southern Baptist Convention, who are currently the loudest voices in the war on Christmas, were deeply suspicious of the holiday well into the 1800s. They viewed it as a Catholic invention. So who fired the first shots in the war on Christmas? It wasn't the atheists, it was the Christians. I want to double tap on why the Puritans and the early American elite hated Christmas so much. It wasn't just because it smelled like Catholicism, it was because Christmas was dangerous. In 17th and 18th century England and America, Christmas wasn't about sitting around a tree opening presents. It was a rowdy, public, drunken street festival. It was closer to a riot than a mass. There was a tradition called wassailing. You might know the song, "Here we come a-wassailing among the leaves so green." It sounds lovely, but listen to the lyrics of "We Wish You a Merry Christmas." Specifically the verse, "Oh, bring us a figgy pudding. We won't go until we get some." That wasn't a request, it was a threat. Working class men would get drunk, form mobs, and march to the houses of the wealthy. They would bang on the doors, sing loud, aggressive songs, and demand the best booze and the best food. If the rich homeowner refused, the mob would throw rocks through the windows, they would tear down the fences, they would assault the owner. This was a ritualized home invasion. It was a social inversion where for a few days the peasants held power, and the rich had to buy them off with luxury goods. They called the leader of these mobs the Lord of Misrule. So when the Massachusetts Bay Colony banned Christmas, they weren't just being buzzkills. They were trying to maintain authority over a holiday that was designed to let the poor exercise autonomy. They were trying to stop the poor from vandalizing their property in the name of baby Jesus. This leads us to the biggest secret of the war on Christmas. The traditional Christmas that the conservatives are fighting to protect, it's younger than the United States. The Christmas we know, trees, Santa, stockings, quiet family dinners, was essentially invented in the 19th century by a group of wealthy New Yorkers, the Knickerbockers, who wanted to get this riotous poor off their lawns. In 1819, Washington Irving, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, wrote a series of stories about an old-fashioned English Christmas at a manor house. He described a cozy domestic holiday where master and servant mingled peacefully and everyone was nice to each other. But here's the catch. Irving made it all up. That old-fashioned Christmas never existed. He wrote it as a roadmap for how he wanted Christmas to look. He was trying to domesticate the holiday. He wanted to take the alcohol-fueled street party and turn it into a child-centered home holiday. Why? Because if you're home with your kids, you aren't throwing rocks through Washington Irving's window. Then in 1822, another wealthy New Yorker, Clement Clark Moore, wrote a poem for his kids called A Visit from St. Nicholas. This is also known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. Moore completely reinvented the Santa Claus. Before this, St. Nick was often depicted as a thin, stern bishop who disciplined kids. Moore made him jolly. Why does this matter? Because Moore shifted the focus of the holiday from adult revelry to childhood wonder. You can't be a drunken lord of misrule if you have to wake up early to see what Santa brought the kids. This was a massive psyop by the American elite to assert authority over the holiday by changing the cultural narrative. And it worked. By the 1850s, the riotous Christmas was dead and the domestic Christmas was born. So when Bill O'Reilly yearns for the good old days of Christmas, he isn't yearning for the birth of Christ. He's yearning for a Victorian social engineering project designed to pacify the working class. But a poem wasn't enough to cement this new authority over the holiday. They needed an icon. They needed a face for the brand. Enter Thomas Nast. He was the most famous political cartoonist of the Civil War era. He also invented the Republican elephant and the Democratic donkey. In the 1860s, Nast started drawing Santa Claus for Harper's Weekly. Before Nast, Santa looked different in every town. Sometimes he was tall, sometimes he was a gnome, sometimes he wore green or brown. This represented local autonomy. Every community had its own version of the legend. Nast killed that autonomy. He drew Santa as a fat, jolly man in a red suit with a white beard, living at the North Pole. He standardized the image. He created a centralized figurehead that everyone could agree on. Then, in the 1930s, Coca-Cola finished the job. They hired an illustrator named Haddon Sundblom, who drew Santa for their ads. Sundblom took Nast's template and gave it the specific rosy-cheeked grandfatherly warmth we know today. He essentially rebranded a 4th century Turkish bishop into a mascot for sugary soda. Why does this matter to our society? Because it proves that the tradition conservatives are fighting for is largely a commercial product. When they get angry that a store clerk won't honor traditional Christmas, they aren't defending the Bible. They are defending a character design finalized by an ad agency in Atlanta to sell soft drinks. The authority they revere is corporate. The reason early American Christians hated Christmas wasn't the theology, it was public order. They recognized that Christmas was just Saturnalia in a cheap tuxedo. The Roman festival of Saturn ran from December 17th to the 23rd. It was basically the Purge meets Mardi Gras. The social order was inverted. Slaves were served by masters, gambling was legal, a peasant was appointed Lord of Misrule to command the chaos. When the church realized they couldn't stop people from celebrating this riotous holiday, they did what any smart corporation does. They acquired it. They absorbed the market share. This explains why the Puritans saw Christmas as the time of drunkenness and murmuring, rowdy door-to-door begging. When they banned Christmas in 1659, they weren't banning Jesus. They were banning the lingering behavior of Saturnalia. And why December 25th? It has nothing to do with a birth certificate. It's solar politics. That date was Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun. Emperor Aurelian established it in 274 AD to celebrate the winter solstice. The church realized they couldn't beat the sun god, so they placed the Son of God on the same calendar square. It was a hostile takeover of prime real estate. While Rome gave us the date and the partying, the Germanic tribes gave us the aesthetic. Yule. In the dead of winter, the only things that stayed green were holly, ivy, and pine. Pagans brought them inside to remind them that life would return. The church redefined the evergreen as a symbol of everlasting life in Christ. But the Puritans saw the tree for what it was, an idol. Jeremiah chapter 12, 2-4 literally warns against cutting a tree from the forest and decking it with silver and gold. Seriously, the Bible is anti-Christmas tree. To a Puritan, dragging a tree into your house was an act of submitting to Northern European paganism, not Christianity. If you need proof that this was a deliberate strategy, we have the receipts. In 601 AD, Pope Gregory the Great wrote a letter to Miletus, a missionary to Britain. He explicitly told him, "Do not destroy the pagan temples. Destroy the idols inside, yes, but keep the buildings. Sprinkle them with holy water, and turn them into churches." His logic was brutal and brilliant. If the people see their familiar temple standing, they will be more likely to come inside and accept the new God. It wasn't an accident. It was a documented military strategy. Don't burn the temple, just change the sign out front. They treated pagan culture like captured infrastructure. We can't talk about the war on Christmas without talking about the actual legal battles, because when O'Reilly was yelling at department stores, the real fight was happening in the Supreme Court, and the results are hilarious. The Christian nationalists want the government to endorse their religion, but the Constitution, specifically the Establishments Clause, says the government can't do that. So how do you put a nativity scene on the courthouse lawn without violating the Constitution? Enter the plastic reindeer rule. This comes from a 1984 Supreme Court case called Lynch versus Donnelly. The city of Pawtucket, Rhode Island, had a Christmas display that included nativity scene, Mary, Joseph, baby Jesus. The ACLU sued, saying, "Hey, that's the government endorsing Christianity." The Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the display was allowed. Why? Because surrounding baby Jesus or a Santa Claus, a Christmas tree, a banner that read "Season's Greetings," and a plastic reindeer. The court argued that because Jesus was surrounded by all of the secular junk, the display wasn't really religious anymore. It was just acknowledging a secular holiday. Justice Brennan, in his dissent, basically said, "You guys are kidding, right? It's Jesus." But this is the same logic the court uses for "In God We Trust" on our money and the national motto. They claim it's not a religious statement. It's just ceremonial deism. They are effectively saying that God's name has been repeated so often by the state that it has lost its theological meaning. This set the legal precedent. If you want to display your holy savior on government property, you have to dilute him. You have to surround him with candy canes and Rudolph. You have to strip him of his divinity and turn him into just another seasonal decoration. This is the ultimate irony of the Christian right. To win the authority to place their symbols on public land, they had to sacrifice the autonomy of their own sacred meaning. They had to agree that Jesus is legally equivalent to a plastic snowman. They won the battle over the courthouse lawn, but they lost the war for the distinctiveness of their faith. They fought to keep Christ in Christmas, and the Supreme Court said, sure, as long as he's standing next to Frosty. We also have to talk about the collateral damage of this war, the other holidays, specifically Hanukkah. In the Jewish religious calendar, Hanukkah is a minor holiday. It's not the Jewish Christmas. It's a commemoration of a military victory and a miracle involving oil. Historically, it didn't involve piles of presents. But in the mid-20th century in America, Jewish parents faced a problem. The cultural authority of Christmas was so overwhelming, the radio, the stores, the schools, the TV specials, that their kids felt crushed by it. They felt alienated. So the American Jewish community exercised a brilliant move of autonomy. They culturally upgraded Hanukkah. They emphasized the gift giving. They elevated the lighting of the menorah to a public act. They effectively created a counterweight to Christmas so their kids wouldn't feel like outsiders in their own country. And this brings us back to the courts. In 1989, the Supreme Court heard a case called County of Allegheny versus the ACLU. The courthouse had a nativity scene inside and a menorah outside. The court ruled that the nativity scene violated the Constitution because it stood alone. It was purely religious. But the menorah, that was allowed. Why? Because it was next to a 45-foot Christmas tree. The court ruled that the tree was secular, and by placing the menorah next to it, the city wasn't endorsing Judaism, it was just celebrating pluralism. So, just like the Christians had to accept Jesus next to a plastic reindeer, the Jewish community had to accept that their sacred candelabra was now legally a prop for diversity. It's the ultimate cost of fighting for space in the public square. You get the visibility, but the government strips the meaning. So where does all this leave us in 2025? It leaves us with a holiday that has been fighting for its own identity for 2,000 years. The ultimate irony of the modern war on Christmas is that the people shouting the loudest about keeping Christ in Christmas are fighting to preserve a holiday constructed from Roman partying, Norse decoration, and secular commercialism, traditions that their own spiritual ancestors tried to ban. The Puritans and the Quakers understood something that modern Christian nationalists have forgotten. You cannot baptize a pagan party and call it holy just because you changed the name on the invitation. This brings us back to the real conflict. This isn't a war about theology, it's a war about authority. When Bill O'Reilly or the V-Dare crowd scream about happy holidays, they aren't worried that you've forgotten Jesus. They are worried that you've forgotten them. They are terrified of a world where their cultural dominance isn't the default setting. They view inclusivity not as kindness, but as a loss of territory. The history of Christmas is the history of autonomy breaking through. The Romans used Saturnalia to briefly escape the authority of the state. The Pilgrims used work to escape the authority of the Anglican Church. And today, people use happy holidays to assert the autonomy of a pluralistic society. Christmas has survived the Roman Empire, it survived the Puritan ban, and it will survive a plain red cup at Starbucks. So whether you are celebrating the return of the sun, the birth of the Savior, or just the fact that you made it through another year without the world ending, do it on your own terms. That isn't a war on Christmas. That is just freedom. And historically speaking, nothing scares an authoritarian more than that. Happy holidays. This has been False Foundation. If you learned something, tell a friend. If you got mad, tell me. You can send your feedback, your arguments, or your own examples of historical stolen valor to jim@falsefoundation.com. I read everything, even the hate mail. Join us next week when we talk about the Black-Robed Brigade.